The dusk was sinking like a slow breath over the valley when she stepped into the threshold, one hand resting on the weathered wood of the doorframe. The wind slipped through the narrow street, carrying the hollow chime of distant temple bells, each note stretching across the empty air like a question without an answer. Beneath her bare feet, the tatami was cold, colder than it should have been for the season, its woven texture biting faintly against her skin. The scent of wood smoke that had clung to the house all afternoon was thinning now, fading with the sun, leaving behind only the raw smell of night. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the rice paddies, frogs began their patient chorus. She told herself they sang because the world was calm. She knew that was a lie. 7 days ago, her husband had promised her 3. He had said it plainly, almost carelessly, like someone who believed the weight of his word would be enough to anchor him back home. But the days had stretched like shadows at sunset, lengthening until they no longer fit inside her grasp. In the first 2 days, she had waited by the road, eyes fixed on the curve where the mountains began. By the 4th, she was counting the creaks in the night air, half believing they were his steps. Now, on the 7th, the silence had grown thick, like damp paper pressing against her chest. She wondered, was the delay an accident, or had something inside him chosen this distance? Life in their corner of the Edo countryside did not forgive absence easily. A husband's return was not just about love. It meant safety, food for winter, the presence of a sword to keep bandits from pressing their luck. A woman alone could manage for a while, but the village whispered about those left waiting too long. Sometimes they were called widows before the truth had the courtesy to arrive. She tried to anchor herself in the small rituals, sweeping the engawa, tending the embers in the hearth, folding and refolding the same robe, but the air seemed to thin each time she remembered the look in his eyes before he left. Calm voice, steady posture, yet a flicker, so brief she might have imagined it, as though something inside him was already far away. The night pressed closer, and with it came that strange weight, the kind that makes you glance over your shoulder even when you know no one is there. She felt the pull between trust and suspicion like the tug of 2 opposing tides. Trust had been the foundation of their years together, built slowly, repaired in quiet after storms, but suspicion moved faster, sharper, tearing through the mind before reason could catch it. She let her gaze drift toward the road again, the horizon barely visible now, a dark line bleeding into the sky. If he had been delayed by storm or illness, she told herself, a messenger would have come. Unless, like a paper lantern left in the rain, her thoughts sagged under the weight of unanswered days. The frame still held, but the light inside was flickering, struggling against a damp wind. She wondered if somewhere in the same darkness he thought of her at all, or if the path he walked now had no intention of leading him back. And tell me, if it were you, standing barefoot on a cold tatami, feeling the night swallow the road your beloved swore to return on, would you still believe in his promise, or would you start to believe in his absence?
The morning he left was wrapped in a pale mist, the kind that blurs the line between the earth and the sky. She had woken early, the kettle already singing over the coals, the faint smell of roasted tea curling into the air. He moved quietly, every gesture deliberate, as though each one was already a farewell. His voice when he finally spoke was steady, almost warm, but his eyes betrayed a distance, a shadow that stretched further than the road outside their home. When he bowed before stepping away, there was the slightest hesitation, the kind that clings to a man when part of him wants to stay. Their home stood in a place that seemed forgotten by time, surrounded on all sides by rice paddies that vanished into the morning fog. A single narrow road cut through the landscape, leading toward the mountains that rose like silent sentinels on the horizon. The quiet was deceptive. In this part of the countryside, isolation was both protection and prison. From the porch, she could see the faint line where his figure had disappeared that morning, the memory of it sharper than any wound. In the days after his departure, her world became a series of small, stubborn tasks. She kept the hearth alive, feeding it with bundles of cedar twigs until the scent of resin clung to her sleeves. She scattered grain for the hens, their clucking filling the silence that might have otherwise consumed her. At night she sat near the door, mending old clothes, the needle sliding in and out of the fabric with a rhythm that matched her own heartbeat. And always her eyes strayed to the shelf where his belongings were kept. It was there, on the third day, that she noticed it, something he had never traveled without. A small lacquered case, the color of deep wine, with its clasp worn from years of use. He had carried it every time he left, no matter how short the journey. To see it resting on the shelf, untouched, was like finding a shadow where sunlight should be. She reached out, her fingers brushing the smooth surface, and felt a pulse of unease ripple through her. Travel in these lands was not kind. The roads twisted through forests where bandits waited for those who traveled alone. Sudden rains could wash away bridges, and the mountain passes hid storms that struck without warning. Political unrest was a quieter threat, but deadlier. Rumors of shifting alliances, sudden arrests, disappearances without explanation. Men could leave their homes with the morning light and be swallowed before nightfall, not by death alone, but by the invisible hand of power. She set the lacquered case back on the shelf, but the question would not leave her. If the man you trusted most left behind the one thing he never parted with, would you believe it was a careless mistake, or would you wonder if it was a message he could not speak aloud?
The wind carried voices before the people themselves arrived, fragments of conversation drifting through the narrow lanes of the village. At first, they were harmless enough, the idle chatter of neighbors who had nothing new to speak of. But soon the words sharpened, changed shape. Some claimed they had seen him walking a different road, one that led not toward the mountains, but toward the coast. Others swore the shogunate was recalling men in secret, summoning them to serve in conflicts whispered about, but never officially named. By the fifth day, the rumors seemed to have a life of their own, multiplying like weeds between the stones. A traveling merchant stopped at her gate, his cart laden with bolts of cloth and jars of pickled plums. While she examined his wares, he spoke in the careful tone of someone delivering news that might wound. The roads, he said, were no longer safe. A village not far from here had been burned to the ground by unknown forces. Some claimed it was bandits, others hinted at soldiers without banners. The air in her chest grew heavier with each word. She tried to cling to loyalty, to the belief that he was simply delayed, but the roots of doubt had already broken through the soil of her patience. That night, she stood outside as the crickets sang, listening to the world beyond her door. The darkness seemed thicker than usual, as if it were holding its breath. An old woman from the neighboring house shuffled toward her, carrying a small bundle of firewood. Her back was bent from years of labor, her eyes pale but sharp. "Don't go looking for him," the woman said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "There are roads you cannot walk without losing more than your way." She spoke of an old superstition, the belief that if you searched for someone who had vanished, you risked crossing into the shadow realm where the living and the dead trade places. In Edo, Japan, rumors were as dangerous as swords. They could slice through a person's ana more cleanly than any steel, and once cut, the wound never healed. The whispers that reached her were no longer just about his absence. They began to question his loyalty, his truth, the very bond they shared. Each rumor was like a splinter driven beneath her skin, small, almost invisible, but deep enough to draw blood. And as they multiplied, she could no longer tell which hurt more, the possibility that the villagers were wrong or that they might be right. The decision came not in a moment of rage, but in the stillness before dawn when the mist lay low across the paddies and the cicadas had yet to stir. She stood in the threshold, her hands curled around the wooden frame of the door, and understood that waiting had become its own kind of prison. The road to the mountains, the one he had promised to return from, unfolded in her mind like an unspoken dare.
Without ceremony, she wrapped a shawl over her shoulders and stepped into the dim light, leaving behind the steady warmth of the hearth. Each footfall on the packed earth felt louder than it should, as though the village itself was listening. The narrow path wound past the rice fields, where morning fog clung to the stalks like pale ghosts, and then into the thinning embrace of the cedars. Somewhere far ahead, a crow cried once and fell silent. Night found her still on the road, the last red light of the sunset drained from the sky. The wind moved through the bamboo stands with a slow, aching creak, and far off, small points of fire marked the watchposts of men she did not wish to meet. It was then she saw him, a figure slumped against the roadside, his straw hat askew, a smear of blood across his sleeve. A Ronin, the steel of his katana catching the faint starlight. She knelt beside him, offering water from her flask. His breath came shallow, his eyes clouded with exhaustion, and something else, warning. "Turn back," he murmured, the words catching in his throat. "This road, it is not yours to walk." She pressed him for more, and he relented only in fragments. There had been betrayals, names traded like coin, allegiances shifting in the dark. Men who once swore fealty now served other masters, and justice had become a matter of who could hold the sword the longest. Somewhere in his broken tale, she heard the shadow of her husband's name, but he would not speak it aloud. The law was clear. During the Edo period, every road was bound by checkpoints, the Sekisho, where papers were inspected and travelers interrogated. To walk beyond them without permission was to invite punishment not only on oneself, but on one's household. She knew this. She also knew she would not turn back. Would you? Would you risk the wrath of the shogunate, the weight of law and steel for a chance to hold the truth in your hands? Or would you walk away, letting the silence decide for you? The temple emerged from the mist like the skeleton of some great beast, its charred beams jutting against the pale sky, blackened ribs of a sanctuary that had once stood in prayer. The air was thick with the ghost of incense, a faint sweetness clinging stubbornly to the acrid stench of burned wood. Ash lay in drifts along the path, clinging to her sandals, whispering under her steps as if reluctant to let her pass. She moved slowly, each footfall an intrusion on the silence. The great bronze bell at the courtyard's edge hung split down the middle, a jagged wound where sound had once lived. A temple this size had been more than a place of worship. It had been a refuge, a meeting ground, a keeper of secrets. Now it was only a grave for the unspoken. Among the ruin, she saw it, a fragment of blue cloth, half buried beneath a fallen beam. She knew it instantly, the weave, the faint, threadbare patch at the corner. It was his. She pulled it free, brushing away the ash, her hands trembling, not from the cold, but from the knowledge blooming inside her. This was no accident of the road. He had been here. He had left something behind, not by chance, but perhaps as a warning or a goodbye. From the shadows of the collapsed hall, movement stirred. An old monk emerged, his robes tattered, his face marked with soot. His eyes were calm in a way that was almost unnerving, as if what had happened here was not tragedy, but inevitability. He spoke softly, in phrases that curled in on themselves, never quite reaching the heart of meaning. Words of depth and loyalty, of betrayal that was older than either of them. Her breath caught as she pieced together the edges of his riddles. Whatever path her husband had walked, it had led him into something darker than simple absence, something that tied his fate to the burning of this place. Temples in the Edo period were more than spiritual sanctuaries. They were political ground, where alliances could be made under the watch of the gods,
and broken with the same quiet finality. She stood there, gripping the cloth until her knuckles ached, knowing that the truth was close but locked behind doors that could only be opened by shattering them. The truth stood before her like a gate with no hinges, impossible to pass without breaking it. Would you break it, knowing that some doors, once opened, can never be closed again?
Dawn bled slowly across the horizon, a pale wash of gold creeping over the paddies, turning the mist into shifting veils of silver. She stood at the edge of the village road, eyes fixed on the distant figure approaching through the morning haze. His gait was unmistakable, steady, measured, the rhythm of a man she had known for years. And yet something was wrong. His head was bowed beneath the brim of a wide straw hat, his face lost in shadow. Her heart pounded against her ribs, a sound loud enough, it seemed, to drown the call of the cranes lifting from the fields. When he reached her, he did not remove the hat. His voice, low, controlled, was not her husband's voice. It was a stranger's, carrying words that cut colder than winter rain. He told her husband was alive, but bound by a duty so absolute that it chained him away from her. A duty that forbade explanation, that turned absence into a sentence with no end. She wanted to scream, to demand details, but his tone left no space for questions. The code of Giri, duty, was stronger than ninjo, the pull of human feeling. In feudal Japan, such bonds could weigh more than love, more than life. She understood the words, but not the choice. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the edge of his sleeve, but he stepped back before her hand could touch. His departure was as silent as his arrival, the straw hat bobbing once before vanishing into the pale distance. Rage, grief, and love crashed inside her like waves on a frozen shore, each one leaving a deeper fracture. If the one you love was kept from you by honor, would you break that honor to have them back? Or would you let them vanish into duty's shadow forever? The nights grew longer after that morning. She remained in the doorway, the paper lantern trembling slightly in her hand, as if the flame inside shared her breath. Every evening, when the sun slipped behind the mountains and the world turned the color of ink, she would light it and place it at the threshold, facing the road he once took. The glow spilled across the tatami, painting the walls in slow, wavering gold, as if trying to hold back the dark. The soundscape of waiting became her companion. The deep croak of frogs in the paddies, the rustle of night wind threading through the cedar trees, the soft crackle of the lantern's flame. Sometimes she swore she could hear footsteps beyond the fields, only to realize it was the shifting of the earth as the night cooled. Her breath formed small clouds in the air, proof of the cold creeping deeper into her bones.
In the village, they stopped asking if she had heard from him. That silence was its own kind of pity. She thought of the stories told by old women, wives who waited not for days or weeks, but for lifetimes. Some men never returned, their absence becoming as permanent as the stones in the river. In the end, she knew her own fate might be the same. Some seasons never truly end. They simply change their name from waiting to remembering. And as she stood in the doorway, her fingers brushing the lantern's handle, she wondered if his choice had been loyalty or betrayal. Tell me, would you keep the light burning, or would you close the door forever? The morning after she asked herself that question, the wind shifted. It carried with it the faintest scent of smoke, not from her own hearth, but from somewhere far off, mingled with the sharp tang of burned cedar. She stepped outside barefoot, the cold biting into her soles, and looked toward the mountains. The air was pale, thin, and brittle, the kind that makes sound travel farther than it should. Somewhere in that distance, she imagined, a door had closed. She tried to work through the day as always, turning the rice in the storehouse, feeding the hens, sweeping the narrow engawa that framed her home. But her hands moved slower, her eyes lingering on the road more often than on their tasks. The villagers passed by without speaking, their glances quick and cautious, as if she were part of some fragile story they did not want to disturb.
That night, she did not light the lantern right away. She waited until the sky was deep enough to swallow the last hints of day, until the silence was heavy and unbroken. When she finally struck the flint, the spark caught in a single bright breath, and for a moment she thought, perhaps, if he were still somewhere in this world, he might see it. But the road remained empty, the only movement the drifting of mist across the fields. And so the question grew heavier in her chest. What if the waiting was no longer for him, but for herself, to decide whether she would remain standing in the doorway or step into the unknown? If it were you, would you take that first step, not knowing if it leads toward him or away forever?
She followed the narrow path at dawn, the mist curling around her ankles like living fingers, damp and unyielding. Each step pressed her further into a world that was not her own, where the scent of wet earth mixed with smoke from distant fires and the sound of bamboo groaning in the wind seemed to whisper secrets meant to be ignored. Her hands clutched the hem of her kimono, the coarse fabric biting at her skin, reminding her with every motion that propriety was a distant luxury here. A wounded Ronin appeared along the road as if summoned by her unease. His armor was scarred, his face lined with battles she would never understand, and his eyes held a caution sharpened by survival. "Turn back," he said softly, each word heavy with unspoken consequences. "The mountains do not forgive the curious, and some truths are too dangerous to follow." She felt the weight of his warning pressing against her chest, yet the emptiness left by her husband's absence was louder, demanding she continue. As they spoke, the distant clatter of hooves and the rustle of unseen movement reminded her that the road was not hers alone. Every shadow held a question, every flicker of fire a threat. The Ronin's voice dropped to a murmur, almost lost in the wind. "Loyalties shift like autumn leaves. Not all men you follow are the ones you think." Her mind turned the words over like a puzzle with missing pieces, and she realized that the path she had chosen was no longer a matter of propriety. It was a matter of survival. And perhaps discovery. Would you walk forward knowing that each step might lead you closer to the truth or to a danger you could never undo? The mist thickened, pressing against her face, and with each inhale, she tasted the faint metallic tang of fear mingled with determination. The road ahead was forbidden, but to turn back now would be to leave her heart behind, and she would not do that. The temple appeared through the haze like a shadow stitched into the mountainside, its timbers blackened and splintered, the scent of scorched incense hanging heavy in the air. She stepped over the threshold of ruin, each footfall on the crumbling stones echoing as if the walls themselves remembered the violence that had come. Her eyes fell upon a fragment of her husband's clothing, charred at the edges, yet unmistakably his, and a cold realization tightened in her chest. His absence was no accident, no simple delay. From the shadows emerged a monk, his robes singed and dust-laden, his gaze sharp despite the exhaustion that lined his face. He spoke in riddles, each phrase a knot that refused to unravel. Debts owed in blood cannot be repaid with words. Loyalty is a blade that cuts both giver and receiver. She felt the weight of his words as if they had been pressed into her skin, and her mind raced to reconcile love with danger, absence with betrayal. The temple, once a sanctuary, now seemed a threshold to truths she was not certain she could bear.
The air carried the acrid tang of smoke and ash, mixing with the faint sweetness of burned incense, an aroma that pricked memory and sorrow alike. She crouched to touch the scorched garment, its fibers fragile beneath her fingers, and each thread seemed to whisper his presence and his peril. Shadows danced in the corners, and the wind moaned through the broken rafters as if mourning alongside her.
Would you step deeper into the ruin, knowing that each discovery could shatter what you believed? Or would you retreat to the safety of ignorance? The truth lay before her like a gate without hinges, impossible to pass without breaking. Yet she knew instinctively that she could not turn away. Every breath drew in smoke and despair, yet she moved forward, guided by love and the faint hope that even here, in the charred remains of faith and home, she might find a path to him. Dawn crept over the horizon with a hesitant glow, brushing the rice paddies with pale gold as she stood at the edge of the village. A lone figure appeared on the narrow road, his silhouette familiar yet unsettling, cloaked beneath a wide straw hat that hid the contours of his face. Her heart beat in a rhythm both hopeful and wary, the air thick with the scent of wet earth and the lingering cold of the night. When he spoke, the voice that reached her ears was not her husband's. It carried the measured calm of a man burdened by duty, not the warmth she had known. He delivered the message with careful words. Her husband lived, yet he was bound by obligations that forbade his return, silenced by the honor he could not betray. Rage and grief collided with the undiminished thread of love, each emotion a jagged stone pressing into her chest. She felt the weight of Giri pressing against her own ninjo, the rigid code of duty crushing personal desire. The road, bathed in the soft light of dawn, seemed impossibly long, stretching between what was and what could never be reclaimed. Around her, the village awakened, the croak of frogs in distant paddies and the whisper of wind through cedars, forming a subtle soundtrack to her heartbreak. Would you forgive a heart kept from you by honor, or would you tear the bonds apart to reclaim what you love? She gripped her lantern as if it were a lifeline, a small flame against the vast uncertainty, knowing that some choices demanded patience that no human heart could endure easily. Every shadow and shimmer of morning reminded her that the absence was not empty, it was deliberate, and it demanded a courage she had only begun to understand.
Nightfall returned with a soft, damp chill, and she remained at the doorway, lantern in hand, the glow trembling against the darkened walls of her home. Each evening, the sounds of the village folding into quiet, the distant rustle of cedars, the low hum of insects, the gentle lapping of water in the paddies, reminded her of the rhythm of waiting, of the life that persisted around absence. She inhaled the damp, earthy scent of the soil and the faint smoke from neighboring hearths, each breath a tether to the world she could no longer navigate with certainty. Her gaze lingered on the horizon, where the first stars began to pierce the indigo sky. Memories of her husband, the curve of his bow, the warmth in his brief smiles, the quiet strength that had once anchored her days, played like shadows across her mind. Time stretched, each night a long corridor of expectation, and she felt the pull of seasons passing with no sign of return. The lantern's flame flickered, as if in sympathy with her heart, small and defiant against the encroaching darkness. In Edo, Japan, countless women had lived like this, bound by the weight of hope and duty, never knowing if the men they loved would walk through the doorway again. Some seasons never ended, they merely changed their name from waiting to remembering. She pressed her hand against the warm wood of the doorframe, feeling the rough texture beneath her fingers, imagining that somehow the subtle vibrations might reach him wherever he remained. Tell me, would you keep waiting, or would you close the door forever? The question hung in the night air, unspoken yet inescapable, echoing in the quiet spaces between the lantern's glow and the shadows of a world that demanded patience beyond measure. The morning she had last seen him replayed in her mind with a clarity that cut sharper than any blade. His voice had been calm, almost rehearsed, yet his eyes lingered on hers with the hesitation she had never noticed before. The tatami beneath her knees had felt cool and unforgiving as she bowed in farewell, the scent of smoked cedar from the hearth mingling with the faint fragrance of his kimono. Outside, the rice paddies shimmered in the early mist, a silver haze stretching toward distant mountains, silent witnesses to the quiet unraveling of certainty.
As the door closed behind him, she noticed something left in the small alcove. A fan, intricately carved, his signature mark almost invisible. He never traveled without it, and yet it lay there, abandoned, a silent tremor in the rhythm of her day. Her hands brushed over it, the polished wood smooth under her fingers, and a question whispered itself. Was this mere forgetfulness, or a message she was not yet meant to understand? The wind carried the scent of wet earth through the open windows, and she shivered, the cold pressing against her spine as if the world itself were warning her of the journey to come. Daily life became a litany of observation and ritual, tending the hearth, feeding the small flock of chickens, keeping watch for messengers who might bring news of him. Each task was infused with the tension of absence, the air heavy with expectation, the clink of pottery and the scratch of straw underfoot, a constant reminder that the ordinary had become extraordinary in its emptiness. Travel in these times was fraught with peril. Bandits, harsh weather, and the subtle shifting intrigues of the shogunate. Every sound outside, the distant cry of a crow, the creak of a bamboo stalk bending in the wind, made her heart tighten. If the man you'd trusted most left behind the one thing he never parted with, would you see it as forgetfulness or a silent message? Whispers began to drift through the village like smoke curling from a dying fire. At first they were faint, almost polite, carried by merchants passing through or children playing near the rice paddies. He was seen on the road to the north, one would murmur, voice low and quick, eyes darting toward the horizon. The shogunate calls men for the border, another added, the words hanging like a shroud. Each fragment of news was a splinter, pricking at her mind, drawing tiny, invisible trails of doubt and fear. A traveling merchant arrived one evening, his pack dusty, leather worn by long roads. He spoke in fragments, stories of villages burned, travelers robbed, and storms that turned paths into rivers. The smell of smoke clung to him, mingled with the tang of dried fish. She listened, hands clasped tightly at her waist, the thin candlelight flickering across her face, illuminating the tension that had begun to coil in her chest. Should she remain patient, loyal to duty and hope, or act against the traditions that bound her? Her elderly neighbor appeared quietly, leaning on a crooked cane, voice like the rustle of bamboo in the wind. "You must not go searching," she warned, eyes shadowed by age and superstition. "Some roads are meant only for the dead or the damned." The words lingered, not threatening but pregnant with possibility, as if the air itself carried consequences she could not yet see. Each rumor, each warning deepened the silence of her home, turning it into a chamber of uncertainty. Each whisper was a splinter in her heart, small but deep enough to draw blood. And you, if the world itself seemed to turn against what you loved, would you wait or step onto the path of danger? The decision pressed against her chest like a stone, cold and immovable, yet impossible to ignore. When the sun dipped behind the mountains, casting long shadows over the narrow road leading from her village, she stepped onto it, tatami slippers replaced by sturdy straw sandals that scraped against the dirt. The air carried the scent of damp earth and distant smoke, each inhalation a reminder that the world beyond her home was unpredictable, alive with danger and secrets. The bamboo groves whispered as the wind bent their slender bodies, and the faint glow of distant watchfires painted flickering orange halos against the night. Somewhere ahead, a lone figure moved with careful deliberation. She found him, a ronin, wounded, leaning heavily on his sword. His eyes, sharp yet weary, studied her as though measuring her worth against the road itself. "Turn back," he said softly, voice like gravel sliding down a slope. "This path carries more than shadows. It carries betrayal, blood, and the eyes of those who would see you vanish." He spoke of shifting loyalties, of villages under silent threat, and of political intrigues that bent like the rivers after storms. Checkpoints, he warned, were strict. The Edo period did not forgive curiosity, and the wrath of the shogunate could follow even the most innocent of steps. Her fingers brushed the hilt of the knife tucked into her sash, heart quickening with a mixture of fear and resolve. Would you risk the wrath of power itself to uncover a truth that might never fully reveal itself? The night deepened, and with each step forward, the world she had known fell behind, leaving only the soft crunch of gravel beneath her sandals and the tension coiled tight in her chest. Smoke and ash hung in the air like a heavy curtain, and the outline of the temple emerged through the gloom, blackened timbers jutting skyward like broken teeth. The scent of charred incense lingered, clinging to her clothes and hair, mixing with the earthy tang of soot. She stepped among the ruins cautiously, each footfall stirring whispers of memories she could not yet name. Her eyes fell upon a piece of her husband's clothing, scorched but unmistakably his, its fibers stubbornly holding the shape of the man who had left her waiting. A monk appeared from the shadows, his robes tattered, face lined with grief and a strange amusement. He spoke in riddles, each word layered with warning and accusation. Debts unpaid, alliances broken, a betrayal that stretched beyond personal hearts into the tangled threads of power. The weight of understanding pressed down, her chest tightening as the truth began to seep through the cracks of her hope. The temple, once a sanctuary, now revealed itself as a stage for clandestine dealings and political entanglements, where the sacred and the profane entwined, like smoke curling toward the heavens.
She traced the edges of the ruined altar, the texture rough and brittle under her fingertips, the silence of the night amplifying the hollow echo of loss. The knowledge settled on her like the ash beneath her feet. Her husband's absence was no accident, no simple misfortune. Like a gate with no hinges, the path forward seemed impossible to pass without breaking, yet the pull of loyalty and love kept her rooted in the wreckage. Could you stand in such a place where every step uncovers more than you wish to know, and yet turn back to the safety of ignorance? The wind stirred, carrying the faint cries of distant creatures and the relentless, whispering ghosts of betrayal. Dawn crept slowly over the rice paddies, brushing the mist with a pale, watery light as she strained to see the approaching figure. At first, it was just a shadow, a familiar rhythm in the gait that made her heart clench. Yet, as he drew closer, the wide straw hat obscured his face, and the voice that eventually spoke was not her husband's, though it carried the same cadence. Each word he uttered seemed to weigh the air down, heavy with restraint and unspoken truths. Her husband lived, bound by duty, forbidden to return or explain. Her chest heaved with a storm of emotions, rage flaring, grief searing, and an unyielding love that refused to bend. The figure's presence was both a comfort and a torment, a cruel mirror reflecting the impossible choices woven into the fabric of Edo's moral code. In that moment, the concept of Giri over Ninjo was no longer abstract. It was a living, breathing force dictating lives and silencing hearts. She felt the roughness of her kimono against clammy skin, the faint chill of morning air seeping through, grounding her in the stark reality of absence. Could you bear the knowledge that the one you love is alive, yet unreachable, held hostage by honor and obligation? Every detail of the village, the creak of the wooden gate, the whisper of wind through the cedars, the distant crow of a rooster, pressed against her awareness, each sound a reminder of waiting and powerlessness. The question hovered, unanswerable yet undeniable. If love demanded the breaking of duty, would you dare to shatter the bonds that kept the world in fragile order? Or would you surrender to the cruel architecture of loyalty? The figure lingered, a sentinel of truth and restraint, as the first light painted the patties gold, marking the hour when longing and duty collided most sharply.
Night settled over the village with a soft, enveloping hush, and she remained at the doorway, lantern in hand, its flickering flame trembling as if in sympathy with her vigil. The weight of waiting pressed down like the thick, humid air before a storm, and each breath she drew mingled with the scent of damp earth, incense drifting from distant shrines, and the faint, lingering smoke of hearth fires long extinguished. The world outside seemed paused, as if holding its own breath, leaving her suspended between hope and resignation. The croak of frogs from the patties, the rustle of wind through cedar branches, the subtle drip of condensation from tiled roofs, all became part of a silent litany, a rhythm that marked the passing nights. She lifted the lantern slightly, peering into the shadows, imagining the figure of her husband returning through the mist, imagining explanations, confessions, and the impossible reconciliation of absence and loyalty. Her hands, roughened by daily labor, gripped the handle as if her touch alone could summon him home. In the Edo period, many women lived their lives bound by such invisible chains, waiting for men who never returned, navigating a world where duty often outweighed desire. She understood, in the marrow of her bones, that some seasons never truly ended. They simply changed their name from waiting to remembering. The lantern's light danced against the tatami floor, shadows stretching like silent witnesses, and she remained there, anchored to a ritual born of love, loss, and unspoken devotion. Tell me, if you were in her place, would you keep the light burning night after night, hoping for a return that might never come? Or would you finally close the door and let the memory linger in the quiet corners of your home? Each night held the same question, unanswered, a meditation on the fragile balance between hope and surrender, between loyalty and the heart's relentless ache. With dawn barely brushing the horizon, you awaken to the remnants of yesterday's quiet despair, your bare feet cold against the tatami as the first thin light glances off the wooden beams. The house feels impossibly large in his absence, each corner heavy with the ghosts of routine, his brush on the shaving stand, the faint indentation of his sleeve where it rested on the table, the half-filled cup of tea left to cool. You notice the small things first, the quiet tick of the water clock, the creak of the sliding door, the way the wind carries the scent of distant paddy fields tinged with morning dew. Your hands move automatically, tending the hearth, feeding the chickens, wiping the floor in slow, meticulous sweeps. The rhythm is both a comfort and a torment, each motion a reminder that life continues, even when the man you depend upon has vanished. One of his belongings catches your eye, a well-worn hat left behind, its brim curled and softened by years of use. A subtle message or an accident? You wonder if he ever intended to leave it there, a fragment of himself to guide you or warn you.
Outside, the road stretches toward the mountains, disappearing into a gray mist. Travel in these parts is perilous. Bandits prowl the narrow passes. Sudden storms can sweep through the rice paddies, and whispers of unrest drift down from the shogunate cities. Your mind wrestles with possibilities, the tension in your chest tightening with each imagined scenario. If the man you trusted most left behind the one thing he never parted with, would you see it as forgetfulness or a silent signal of something darker? The question lingers, unspoken, while the day begins its slow crawl toward another evening of uncertainty. The village awakens slowly, the faint clatter of wooden sandals against packed earth blending with the low bleat of goats and the rustle of rice stalks swaying in the morning wind. You move among these familiar sights, yet everything feels altered, as if the absence of his presence has shifted the color of the light itself. From the far edge of the road, a merchant's voice rises, brittle and hurried, carrying fragments of news. A burned village, travelers attacked, roads unsafe. Each word is a knife that cuts between your ribs and leaves your stomach hollow. Whispers curl through the air like smoke, slipping through doorways and sliding down narrow alleys. Some speak of seeing him on another path. Others claim the shogunate has summoned men for an unknown purpose. You feel eyes upon you as you walk. Neighbors' glances heavy with concern and suspicion. An elderly woman, leaning on her crooked cane, approaches in a voice cracked by time. Do not follow, child. The wind carries spirits of those who do not return. Her warning lingers, like the faint scent of incense, a reminder that rumor is as dangerous as the sharpest blade in these lands. You stand at the edge of the rice paddies, listening to the wind scrape over the thatched roofs, each whisper burrowing under your ribs, each fragment of news a splinter in your heart. The line between loyalty and self-preservation blurs with every passing moment. If the world has become a stage for gossip and fear, would you stay bound by duty, or would you let your feet carry you toward the unknown, toward the possibility of finding him or something far darker? Each step feels both inevitable and forbidden, a dance with danger that you cannot yet name. The road ahead narrows as shadows stretch long beneath the mountains, the bamboo groves creaking in rhythm with the wind, each movement sounding like a whisper of warning. You press forward, heart hammering against ribs that ache with tension, knowing that every step defies the customs that have bound women for generations. The dirt path is rough underfoot, packed with remnants of last night's rain, clinging to your ankles like reluctant memory.
A figure emerges from the dim glow of a distant watchfire, a man cloaked in dust and shadow, his presence both a comfort and a threat. His eyes are sharp, assessing, and when he speaks, the words are measured, almost teasingly cryptic. Turn back, or the path you seek will be the one that claims you. The wind carries the metallic tang of blood, the faint scent of smoke from fires long extinguished, mingling with the earthy aroma of wet foliage. You sense that loyalty and betrayal intertwine here, as inseparable as shadow and light. He gestures toward the peaks above, a caution wrapped in urgency. Tales of political unrest, of villages razed, and of men swept into conflicts they cannot refuse, hang unspoken between you. Each creak of bamboo, each distant howl of an animal, becomes a marker of the unseen dangers that blanket the mountains. If you continue, you risk more than your reputation. You risk the wrath of authorities whose eyes see all and forgive little. Yet every fiber of your being presses onward. Would you, if you were here, step into that uncertain night, guided only by hope and the memory of the man you love? The road offers no answers, only the relentless pull of possibility and peril. The charred remains of the temple rise from the mist like a blackened skeleton, its timbers groaning under the weight of their own destruction. The smell of scorched incense clings to the air, sharp and clinging, making your throat dry with the taste of smoke. You step carefully over broken beams and shattered pottery, each footfall a soft percussion against the hollowed silence. In the stillness, the world feels suspended, as if time itself has paused to witness what remains. Among the ruins, your gaze falls on a familiar piece of cloth, singed at the edges but unmistakably belonging to him. The sight grips your chest, a jolt of hope intertwined with a sting of dread. A monk emerges from the shadows,
robes tattered, eyes carrying the weight of secrets better left unspoken. His voice calm but riddled with enigmatic intent, murmurs of debts, betrayals, and choices that can no longer be undone. You feel the pulse of truth beneath his words, elusive yet undeniable, pressing you to confront a reality far darker than absence or misfortune. Around you, the remnants of the temple whisper history, the role of such sanctuaries as both spiritual havens and covert meeting grounds, where power and faith intertwined in silent conspiracy. Smoke curls like restless spirits, and the air vibrates with memories of voices long silenced. Your hands brush against the scorched wood, rough and splintered, and you wonder if duty has ensnared him in ways you cannot yet see. Will the weight of loyalty demand more than your heart can bear? The truth, like the gate before you, stands immovable, impossible to pass without shattering something within. Dawn seeps slowly over the horizon, painting the village in muted shades of gold and gray. You stand at the edge of the path, heart hammering, as a lone figure emerges from the mist. The straw hat obscures his face, and yet the rhythm of his walk, the tilt of his shoulders, the measured step feels painfully familiar. Your breath catches, hope and fear colliding like waves against rocks. When he speaks, the voice that reaches you is not his, yet carries a message heavy with impossible weight. His words are careful, deliberate. Your husband is alive, bound by duty that forbids his return, bound also to silence, unable to offer explanation or reassurance. Rage curls in your stomach, grief tightens around your throat, and a stubborn, aching love refuses to release him. The world seems to tilt, the familiar village now foreign under the weight of this revelation.
You recall the code that governs hearts and honor in Edo, Japan, the relentless Giri that eclipses Ninjo. The figure leaves as quietly as he arrived, footsteps fading into the rustling of the cedars, leaving you with a silence that screams. You are left at the edge of the path, torn between obedience and desire, loyalty and despair, wondering if the path to truth is worth defying the very law that has shaped your life. Each heartbeat pulses with the question, if the one you love is kept from you by honor, would you break it to reclaim them? Night descends with a slow, deliberate weight, folding the village into shadows that tremble under the sway of the cedars. You remain at the doorway, lantern in hand, its flickering flame casting quivering shapes across the tatami. The world around you hums with small, intimate life, the croak of frogs in the paddies, the whisper of wind through rice stalks, the distant hoot of an owl. But each sound only deepens the ache of absence. Every evening, you imagine the lantern as a guide, a fragile thread stretching across distance and time, hoping it might lead him home. The air is heavy with the scent of damp earth and faint wood smoke, a reminder of the hearth he once tended. Your fingers tighten around the handle, the warmth from the flame seeping into your palm, a small defiance against the cold uncertainty pressing from all sides. Seasons pass, one folding quietly into the next, and still you wait, tracing the outlines of memory in the darkened room, feeling the silence as both companion and tormentor. You remember the countless women of Edo, Japan, living entire lifetimes in the shadow of absent husbands, their devotion unwavering despite the absence, their hearts balancing on the knife edge of hope and despair. Like them, you are suspended in a world without resolution, where some seasons never end. They only change their name from waiting to remembering. And as you lift your gaze to the night sky, wondering if he will ever return, the question lingers, heavy and unbroken. Would you keep waiting, or would you close the door forever?